Hello everyone, welcome to our second lecture on Nirod C. Chaudhury's An Autobiography, the autobiography of an unknown Indian. In the previous class, we talked about autobiography in general, what it entails, what does the genre mean, or what does it hint at. Today, as promised, I have brought together a brief history of Indian autobiography or Indo Anglican autobiography. So now, without further ado, let's go into it. Now, the first autobiographical writing, not a proper autobiography, in English can be traced back to Raja Ram Mohan Rai. Okay. Now, in 1834, soon after what Ram Mohan did, Ram Mohan lived from 1772 to 1833. Now, right after Ram Mohan's death, we have Kashi Prasad Ghosh's brief account of his own life, which he wrote about in a letter to the Reverend James Long. However, the first full fledged autobiography which we find is by Lutfullah, which was published in 1854. Now, soon after its publication in 1857, it kind of got a lot of attention from the English speaking people, from the English reader, and several editions of it were sold in a very brief period of time. Now, in his autobiography, Lutfullah is not very explicit about his motives, but it is apparent that a variety of highly exciting and colorful experiences moved him to write about his own life. Now, he might well had in mind a particular audience, that is, the Englishmen and the women with whom he wished to communicate and share his experiences in their own language. But let's come to the next autobiography, which is the full-length autobiography of Lal Bihari Dey, written between 1873 and 76, called Recollections. Now, this book begins with a very brief account of his childhood, and then he comes quickly to the day when he was admitted to the village school. A Brahmin astrologer fixed an auspicious day for his initiation into reading and writing, which was the norm of the day. Now, that day, after some religious services, uh, he accompanied his father to the school, and he describes the school building and his surroundings, and then he introduces uh, to his teacher in a very lively vein and in a very humorous vein, who believed in the saying that spare the rod and spoil the child. Now, fortunately, he did not have to be long under the tutelage of this master. His father was a broker in Calcutta, and he realized the value of English education. And in 1834, when Lal Bihari Dey was only 8 years old, he was called to stay with him to avail the full-fledged English education available in the time. And he describes his separation from his mother, who was not in favor of sending him to Calcutta, where it was rumored that young men were lured away from their own religion. Now, with Lal Bihari Dey, something important happened to the Indo Anglican tradition of autobiography writing. That is, where he was writing from, it was very emotional. It was very first hand knowledge of the autobiography, and Lal Bihari Dey brought the end of autobiography in the 19th century. Although there have been sporadic references to autobiographies and sporadic autobiographies as well. Like in 1892, Nishikanta Chattopadhyay published his Reminiscences of German University Life. And towards the close of the century, Prince Dwarokanath Thakur, uh, Mahorshi Devendranath Thakur, his son, wrote the autobiography in Bengali, his own autobiography, which was later translated into English in 1909, and it had a considerable impact on autobiography as a genre as we know it today. Now, the first autobiography of the 20th century was published in 1905, and it basically carries forward the sensibilities and senses of the 19th century. It was the reminiscences of a retired Hindu official by A. Balakrishna Mudaliar. And this is more of a Hindu philosophy book than an autobiography. Now, Lala Lajpat Rai wrote his own autobiography, The Story of My Deportation. Now, this is his story of his exile from the 9th of May 1907 to the 18th of November 1907. And it is a poignant evocation of the human side of the great leader, who with Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Bipin Chandra Pal formed the unity of a militant Indian anti-partition agitation, uh, a militant Indian movement during the anti-partition agitation. Now, there is another person whose name is Shamsundar Chakraborty, who, along with Lala Lajpat Rai and others, was deported in 1907 by the British government. And he also wrote about his prison experiences in uh, this same period. And his memoir is called Through Solitude and Sorrows. Now, Lal Bihari De, once again, is My Days with Uncle Sam, and Bipin Krishna Bose's Stray Thoughts on Some Incidents in My Life were published from Bengal in 1919. Now, the first autobiographical sketch, which was very interesting, was the autobiography of Bipin Krishna Bose, an engineer who went to America with only 5 rupees in his pocket. And then he became a lawyer of the central provinces, now which is called Madhya Pradesh. He writes his life to justify his pro English activities and yet proves the genuineness of his patriotic feelings. Now, in his two books, My Conversion, written in 1919, and 50 Years Pilgrimage of a Convert in 1921, uh, A.S. Appasamy Pillai tells the story of his own life in which his conversion into Christianity and Christian faith was the central event. On the other hand, Maulana Muhammad Ali, one of the major leaders of the Khilafat movement, wrote a short autobiographical sketch called My Life a Fragment. It was written between 1921 and 1922. And the Maulana's intention was to show how a study of the Holy Quran wrought a change in his whole attitude to life and made him increasingly religious. Now, it is written in a very humorous style, and his life sketch is at best a very pleasant reading. Now, the well-known revolutionary of Bengal, Barindra Kumar Ghosh, he wrote his own experiences, the harrowing experiences of his prison days in 1922 in his book, The Tale of My Exile. Kunal Chandra Sen, on the other hand, has placed a record which is highly interesting, and it talks about his very uh, interesting career. And it was published in the same year, 1922, and the name of the book is Through War, Rebellion, and Riot. Now, in Caste and Outcast, published in 1923, Dhanagopal Mukherjee uh, who was called a very lovable and interesting person by Krishna Singh, he tells his life story around a very different theme. That is, the first part of the book contains his story from his early childhood to his journey to Japan, and the second part is an account of his stay in the United States of America. Now, basically, his motive, he has a very conscious motive, and this is to explain the real meaning of the Hindu customs and rituals to the Western audiences. So, from here onwards, we see that the autobiography is having specific motives, and that is very interesting. And in this period, in the 1920s, excuse me, some very important autobiographies were written, like Surendranath Banerjee's A Nation in Making in 1925, and Mahatma Gandhi's famous autobiography, an autobiography or the story of my experiments with truth. It came out in 1927. Now, Surendranath's biography is very biased, and he often offers very one-sided interpretations of his own lives, own times, and certain events. However, his autobiography is interesting nonetheless, because it represents the times as well. But Gandhi, on the other hand, was very, very prevalent to write the story of his life, and also the lives of his co-workers. But his autobiography is born out of an inner spiritual compulsion. And therefore, we see that an intense fidelity to truth distinguishes his life as well as his autobiography, and the standard of the verity and the vivacity and veracity, and also the candor with which he composes his autobiography, is something to strive for. And the only parallel that comes to my mind right now is perhaps Jean Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, because Gandhi does not try to hide anything. He does not try to blackmark those pages of his life which we do not speak of in the civil society. Now, in 1927, we have another interesting autobiography called On Paths of Life by Puran Singh. And in this book on Paths of Life, Puran Singh makes an attempt to live again in the days of his infancy, in the dreams of his youth, and forget the calculations and plans of an experienced and tired intellectual. And he deliberately goes back to his childhood to recapture its glory and its freshness, and emerges from the pages of the book as unusually a sensitive person. Now, in 1932, the autobiography saw a boom because three very important autobiographies were published in this year. One is Bipin Chandra Pal's Memories of My Life and Times. The second is Sri Purohit Swami, who influenced W.B. Yeats to a great deal. So, Sri Purohit Swami is an Indian monk, and Prashanta Chandra Rai's life and experiences, Prafulla Chandra Rai's life and experiences of a Bengali chemist. Now, Bipin Chandra Pal wrote the story of his life when he was quite old and he had retired from active politics. On the other hand, an Indian monk written by Sri Purohit Swami has an unusual life story to tell of an ascetic, of an Indian man who decided to pursue God himself. The account is, I would say, sincere, revealing, and interesting. However, in Life and Experiences of a Bengali Chemist, which was published in two volumes, this remains till date the only autobiography of an Indian scientist, if not the only in the 1930s. So the first volume is autobiographical by P.C. Roy, and the second is a collection of essays which vary from social, political, economic, cultural problems. And as we all know, that P.C. Roy was a multifaceted personality, a brilliant personality, and his career was not limited just to science but extended to other areas of social experience as well. In the next year, 1933, K. Subba Rao wrote about his struggles as a journalist, and he openly spoke about the people who influenced him or helped him in his journalistic careers in his autobiography Revived Memories. Now, there was another interesting autobiography in the same year called How to Climb the Service Ladder by Bhola Singh, who was a high ranking officer in the Indian Railways. And he just simply summed up his entire lifetime experiences of being in the bureaucracy and gave very interesting and very practical advices to young people who wish to go into the services. Now, in the next year, in 1934, Cornelia Sorabji wrote a very humorous and a very racy autobiography called India Calling. And this talks about her fascinating life story as the first woman lawyer of India. And she had to wage relentless struggles to win her rightful place in a discipline which was primarily dominated by men back in those days. The next autobiography really doesn't demand much uh, commentary because this is Jawharlal Nehru's an autobiography. It is a landmark in the history of the Indian autobiographies, and it was written in jail from June 1944, 1934 to February of 1935, and it was published in 1936. Now, this is not just a most authentic statement of his political credo and also his own political visions, but this serves as a vivid portrayal of the politics of the time, the situation of the time, and it gives us a very interesting peek into the person Nehru, into his own psyche, so that we can see that how he shaped himself into the great leader that he was through his own personality. Now, in since we are talking about 1936, there is another very interesting autobiography uh, by D.K. Karve. The name of the autobiography is Looking Back. D.K. Karve was a pioneer of the women's education and a champion of the widow remarriage in India. And he set an example by marrying a widow himself. And he writes about the efforts of his own education and later the triumphs and trials of his own attempts and attempts at educating the women. Now, in 1937, My Search for Truth, which was a short sketch of the philosophical development of Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, was published. And he explains in a very crisp and precise way how he became a defender of the Hindu religion and the Hindu thought, and how he came to the conclusion that only through a Hindu way can the social ills of the modern civilization be curbed. Now, 1937 is a very interesting year because you see, in December of 1937, when he was staying in Austria for just 10 days, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose composed his autobiography, An Indian Pilgrim. And it covers only a short period of his own life, that is from 1897 to 1920, when he actually resigned the Indian civil services. Yet it kind of offers a very clear picture of the formative influences and the formative period of his own life. Now, in 1944, I'm jumping a bit, Krishna Puthi Singh wrote the autobiography with no regrets, an autobiography, and it is more like a chronicle than an autobiography. And the central figure is the author herself, uh, as we would have thought, but the central figure is not her. It is her father, Motilal Nehru, and her brother, Jawharlal Nehru. And very characteristically and with a very candid demeanor, she talks about her happy childhood and her difficult and rebellious adolescence. Now, later, she describes as uh, her travels to Switzerland and her permanent stay over there with her ailing sister in law, Kamala Nehru, and her travels with her father and her brother on the continent, meeting the eminent personalities of that time, like Romarola, Ernst Toller, and Einstein himself as well. And she gives such a lively detail of a Satyagrahi prisoner, which she herself was. And there are certain passages where she talks about the death of her parents and her aunt being widowed, and basically also of her courtship and marriage. So, which was very unconventional back in those times. That a woman writing about her own courtship and marriage in her autobiography, that was not quite taken well by the Indian audiences. Now, in his Apology for Heroism, a brief autobiography of ideas. Okay, let me once again club up. In 1946, we have some very interesting autobiographies. There is Mulk Raj Anand's Apology for Heroism, a brief autobiography of ideas. Hemchandra Mitra's My Reminiscences. Uh, Chimanlal H. Svelad's Recollection and Reflections. And Paramhansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. All of them were published in 1946. Now, Mulk Raj Anand, who was an Indian novelist who wrote in English, we see that in his Apology for Heroism, a brief autobiography of ideas, he's tracing his own development as a novelist, and he kind of finds that his interest in philosophy arose from the sheer curiosity and the desire to know himself and the world around him. On the other hand, in my reminiscences, Hemchandra Mitro, who was a very successful lawyer at Chapra, a small town in Bihar, he writes about his own life at the local bar association. And a renowned legal practitioner of his time, uh, Setalvad, that is Chimanlal H. Setalvad, he covers the various spheres of his public activity, including his university days, his municipal corporation days, his legislature, and his politics days as well. Now, it is basically a memoir rather than an autobiography because here the tone is very egotistical and it is a jumbled up collection of reminiscences. On the other hand, uh, Swami Yogananda's autobiography is basically a reverence offered towards his guru, whose miracles are recounted in details, and basically at times they are very tiresome to read. Now, in 1947, Reflections and Reminiscences of Nogendranath Gupta is very remarkable and very enticing as a piece of um, the author's early days in Bihar, and there are certain very interesting pen portraits over here of eminent personalities like Ramakrishna Paramhansa, Swami Vivekananda, Keshav Chandra Sen, Rabindranath Tagore, and Lala Lajpat Rai, to mention a few. In 1948, we have another interesting autobiography by Gulab Singh. The name of the autobiography is Thorns and Thistles, Autobiography of a Revolutionary. And this is the autobiography which talks about his activities as a member of the Revolutionary Party, which was working for the Indian cause of freedom, and also of his long term imprisonment from 1930 to 1946. Now, in 1948, we have the first volume of Horindranath Chattopadhyay's Life and Myself. And this is a very humorous account of the growth of his poetic sensibility. And there was supposed to be a subsequent volume, which was never published. Now, in 1950, we have a very factual and chronological and, to be frank, very boring autobiography of Nripendra Chandra Banerjee called At the Crossroads. Now, it describes his childhood in a prosperous East Bengal village and his school and college days in Dhaka and at Calcutta. Now, this is a very historical documentation, but frankly, I found it very boring. Now, for historians, this is an autobiography of exceptional value because they can find a lot of details. But for a literature student, I doubt how interesting it would be. Now, A.S. Iyengar's All Through the Gandhian Era, written in 1950, is a simple narration of his journalistic career, which spread over for 35 years from 1915 to 1950. And this is a very interesting period in the Indian political history because the leadership went through quite an upheaval. And Iyengar served as the principal information officer of the government of India back then. And therefore, you can really understand that he saw it from the ground zero. Now, in 1950, Savitri Devi Nanda wrote her autobiography, her story of life, called A City of Two Gateways. Now, this is a very sensitive autobiography of a girl from Punjab who wrote with very unusual perceptiveness and vividness. And this is written in a very accomplished tone of a story writer. Now, she recalls every detail of her early life in a typical Hindu aristocratic family of the pre partition Punjab, and nothing seems to escape her observant eyes. And her account is intensely personal, and not even for a moment does she lose sight of her experiences, herself, and how she relates to the external world. And we can see that Basically, as she goes on, her motive and her style keeps on changing. In the next year, 1951, there were again a host of autobiographies like Harbilas Sardar's Recollections and Reminiscences, M. Vishweshwaraya's Memories of My Working Life, M. Chinna Subbarao's Myself and Rural Life, Santa Ramarao's Gifts of Passage, Nirod C. Chaudhary's The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian, and Hazari's An Indian Outcast. Now, Sardar was an architect of the Child Marriage Restraint Act, which is known as the Sardar Act nowadays. And it, the autobiography talks about his extensive travels and his trials and tribulations during this course of his life. On the other hand, Vishweshwaraya was a known engineer, a renowned engineer from Mysore, and basically this talks about his strict professional character, of his strict professional career, and basically chiefly writes about the projects he executed and he supervised. On the other hand, Subbarao's major concern is to talk about rural life. Now, basically, these three books belong to the older generation and they pursue the traditional mode. Now, Ramarao's Gift of Passage is basically a very sporadic, periodic collection of autobiographical events. The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian is a significant contribution to the entire genre of autobiography because it tells the story of a very unique man. And this man's character has been built by the conglomerate coagulation and the confusion and the battle between two different civilizations. And his idiosyncrasies add to the beauty of his creative style. Now, on the other hand, Mr. Hazari, in his An Indian Outcast, the autobiography of an untouchable, draws our attention to the first autobiography of an untouchable. And this is the story of the struggles of a deeply sensitive and ambitious person belonging to the lowest strata of the Indian society. So, this is what I wanted to deal with today. That is a brief history of autobiography as a genre till the period of time that Nirod Chaudhary himself was writing. And I hope I have been able to successfully give you a very brief history. So, I have been studying for some time and I have been collecting a lot of data from the internet, from several books that I have. And so, this was what I could gather. With this, I end today's lecture and hope to see you soon with a new lecture on either Nirod Chaudhary or something else. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day. And if there are any questions, put them in the comment section.